Hello, and welcome to Equalise, the ESRC Centre for Life Course Health Equity. Equalise is a £9.6 million research centre funded by the Economic Social Research Council from 2025 to 2030. The centre is led by Professors Yvonne Kelly and Anne McMahon and based at the University College London. Our work focuses on tackling health inequities, systemic, unfair and avoidable differences in health, using mixed methods and interdisciplinary research. We are engaged in partnerships with over 30 organisations from higher education, government and the third sector. If you're interested in our work, please contact us via email at equalise@ucl.ac.uk. Thank you for engaging with our work and we hope you enjoy the session.
Equalise is very, very embedded in what I call the policy process, and you do it on purpose. And I think that offers something different to what I'm going to present today and a step forward from that. So what I'm hoping is to get lots of discussion at the end and lots of reaction on what the models of the policy, research and policy process that I'm going to set out differ from yours or illuminate, or how your work can illuminate the way forward for these methods of analysing the research and policy process. If we go right back to the 1970s and before, and the work of, for example, Robert Merton, the great sociologist, academics represented the relationship between research and policy in a very kind of black and white way. A practical policy problem arises. The policy people or the pressure group, which is put pressure on to get this policy on the agenda, and I'll call them the users, they ask for evidence from the scientists. The scientists come up with the answer to the policy problem, and this is called the linear model. And I think one of your colleagues presented a very nice portrayal of the linear model a few weeks ago at another seminar. But this is sort of how it worked. To give you an example of the linear model, was the work of Elwood and Gallagher, who got involved in a debate on whether environmental lead was dangerous. And I repeat, this is back in the 70s and 80s. And in 1984, when they published their work, the case was regarded as not proven. The debate was not settled. And strangely enough, I mean, quite appropriate in a way, I don't actually know how that turned out in the end. I don't know. Somebody can enlighten us at the end. Elwood and Gallagher was worried. They were public health doctors, and they were worried about why this debate had sort of hung fire. And there was no measures. The debate hadn't been settled enough for any measures to be taken to get rid of environmental lead. And they concluded the reason for this hiatus in the argument was that there was not enough separation between science and policy. And this is the way they described the separation that they thought should exist. And I quote from their paper in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, which is now JEC, that we all know and love. They said, scientific conclusions are arrived at after subjecting the available data to the most severe scrutiny and impartial criticism in order to determine those interpretations of the data that may be made on purely rational grounds. And they were talking about something that scientists would do. Compare, set one set of data, hypothesis, and set another hypothesis, and test the hypothesis between each other with no involvement of any policy issue. And I found this little cartoon, which I thought illustrated the traditional view of the science-policy relationship. There's your scientist peering down her microscope, and there's your politician. It's an American politician, declaiming his political views and trying to persuade people to vote for him. And in this conventional view, social policy, according to Elwood and Gallagher, social policy is made as a result of compromise between conflicting interests in society and essentially involves consensus rather than rational argument. So social policy is not made by rational argument. The science the scientific process, on the other hand, is entirely based on rational argument. And the two processes, they said, are quite distinct and must be conducted exclusively in their own terms. So scientists shouldn't refer to policy process at all. Politicians should not mix themselves up and try to influence science. And they go on, there has been a regrettable and avoidable confusion over which parts of the argument were scientific. This is the argument about whether lead in the environment is dangerous. Which parts of the argument were scientific and which were political. Now, of course, the first thing that comes to mind, because this is an old argument about lead, is what we constantly hear about climate change. And you can fit this, you can set the climate change argument against what Elwood and Gallagher's and their perfect linear model, and see what you can already begin to see what big differences there are. And they concluded that there had been a blurring of the distinction between political process and scientific process that had reduced the scientific defensibility of policy. So this mixing up of scientists and policymakers resulted in the inability to make a decision on the real truth about lead in the environment. And they concluded that the difficulties which were being experienced in understanding the effect of lead in the environment on health could be attributed to the failure to maintain these clear boundaries and too close an involvement of scientists with non-scientists. Leave that recipe for food. Now, contrast this. This will already have occurred to most people, I'm sure. Contrast this with what we now call the impact agenda. Today, we are urged to connect our science as closely as possible to policy and public debate. In the days of the impact agenda, Elwood and Gallagher's critique seems very strange, and their insistence on this strict division between science and policy, which, by the way, I was brought up in, and I was very shocked when people started telling me, "Oh, you've got to make sure your science has it." I even gave a talk once down in Westminster about unemployment and health, and somebody, I think it was the chairperson, asked me, "Well, what are they?" I presented some data which a bunch of us had completely sweated over for a couple of years, and he said, "Well, what's the implication for policy of what you're showing us?" And I said, "That's not my job." And he said to me, "Oh, I see, that's above your pay grade, is it?" Which rather made the audience groan a bit. But so that was like, 2010 or something like that. I really didn't consider it my job to start influencing the people who set policy about benefits, for example, and so on and so forth. And I was quite proud of that. I would stand there and say, no, I'm just doing this science. Now, in the 1980s already, a critique was arising, a criticism of this linear view where science and policy are completely separated. And one of the arguments was that there's actually not such a strong division between inside and outside of the laboratory or the scientific or the epidemiology department, or whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to say. Maybe this strict linear view with separation combined with a communication of a demand from the policy people and an answer from the scientists, and the scientists would work out the answer without any reference to the policy people. Of course, the first thing that springs to mind when I say this, say, well, who do we think was paying for the scientists? And of course, that's one of the big issues which ruins the linear model. And in the 1980s, there were alternative views of the science-policy relationship by several very clever people who wrote very clever articles about how they thought it really worked. One of them was Barbara Tizard, who put forward what she called a gateway model. Another one was a guy called Booth, who had a political model. Ryan had a latent policy model. Lindblom's model was called partisan mutual adjustment, which I think is a brilliant term, actually, and comes very close to describing in 3 words the way things actually work. And then there was from a separate tradition, work by Bruno Latour in the strong program of science and technology studies, which some people call a translation model, other people call it an actor network model. Now, Tizard's gateway model was hugely successful, or rather she herself using this model in her head, although she only wrote about it later. I knew her, I worked for her, and she was hugely successful in influencing policy on young children. And her conclusion from all her work on this, after many years of very distinguished practice, she concluded that the influence, or what we would now call impact, had nothing to do with the quality of the research. And that was, when she came out and said that, she used to write these kind of articles in psychology journals. That came as a huge blow. You mean it doesn't matter how good it came as a huge blow to me, actually. Rather, the impact of research depends on the researcher having access to gateways, such as professional advisors to politicians. So if you want your research to be influential on policy, you have to know the right people, basically. And one of the things I discovered, Heather actually helped me to discover this. I couldn't understand why Heather kept trying to introduce me to these certain friends of hers. They were all very nice people, and they were mostly senior civil servants. And I thought, I wonder where she knows all these people from. And of course, eventually, it turned out, years later, they'd all been students together at Oxford University. So one of the main gateways into influencing policy, and I suffered from this greatly because I didn't go to Oxford University. So I had to make friends with civil servants and leaders of pressure groups and what have you, all on my own, using my natural charm. I had one day I went to interview a civil servant for my thesis work, and another one came in. Peter Goldblatt knew me at this time, so he'll remember all this. And another one came in who I'd previously interviewed, and the one had just come in and said to the one I was interviewing, "Oh, you want to watch out for her. She eats civil servants for breakfast." And I was regarded as somebody who kind of got them to say things that they didn't really want to say. And I learned a huge amount just from sitting down and talking to these people. And a piece of advice, actually, and I'm going to do a linear model of advice here for you. Get to know these people if you get half a chance, and listen to them. They are very bright, and they will think up questions that most academics would never think up. And these will give you actually research which will advance your own career. They will give you research questions which are really clever stuff. But it takes effort, it takes time, but it's definitely worth it. So what Tizard concluded was that there has to be some degree of match between the ideology of the researcher, as she put it, and the guardians of the gateways. So in other words, if you're a kind of social reformer, as Barbara was, you need to find your way into the policy process by finding roughly sympathetic people involved in things like pressure groups and government departments and NGOs. So that's Barbara. Booth's political model raised another very important point, which I'm sure Barbara Tizard would have agreed with. Research is often used to legitimate policy that would have happened anyway. And this is a very embarrassing fact that those of us who do research have to face up to, that when your research gets a huge amount of impact, I mean, I'll take as an example the research on the genetics of social mobility and the genetics of educational attainment, where whatever motivates this work to get this massive amount of gets in the newspapers. I'm not sure I would say it would have an impact on government policy, but this genetic work, they can see that the people in charge can see that this work can at some point be used to legitimate inequality. And therefore, it gets funded like you wouldn't believe. So that's research being used to legitimate policy that would have happened anyway. That's just one example. Policymakers use research selectively to vindicate the status quo. Absolutely. Research is used to head off the need for action, and researchers are partisans. We researchers have to be partisans for the value of our research among the many conflicting interests of the people we need to engage with, which is a very good bit of advice as well. Ryan, in turn, had a latent policy model. He says there's actually no such thing as knowledge utilization as a one-way process. It's not that cartoon I showed you with the little researcher on one side and the politician on the other. Ryan went so far as to say there are no facts that are independent of the policy considerations that inform them. The analytic concepts are themselves policy concepts. So that in fact, and this is very much the position taken by Donald Mackenzie in his book on medical statistics in Britain, he could see that the ideas that came out were already deeply influenced by what the scientists wanted to be the case in terms of inheritance and eugenic inheritance. And Ryan went on to say, the challenge is not linking research to policy, but uncovering the latent policies which organize the research. And finally, Lindblom's, before I get to Latour, Lindblom's partisan mutual adjustment model put forward the idea that experts and policy actors engage in negotiations to arrive at both a satisfactory account of what the facts are and an agreeable answer to a policy question. When you've done that, then you've got your impact. You've enrolled policymakers. They will both implement what you suggest as a solution, but also they will affect the factual status, the reality of the research that you've done, which helps them to do what they wanted to do. And Lindblom says science and policy are mutually constitutive. They construct each other. And finally, from as I said before, a different tradition, Bruno Latour raises the whole issue of who is paying for all this. I'm sorry, I've got a cough in him. And he says, if you get inside a laboratory, you see no public relations, no politics, no ethical problems, certainly no class struggle. You see science isolated from society. And what the position he was putting forward was this isolation of science from society, which Elwood and Gallagher thought had begun to crumble, is actually constructed by the scientists as one of their raison d'etre. That if you as a scientist, if you were not seen as separate from the policy process, then your work would just be seen as partisan. Now, this is something which recently is completely breaking down, which I'm sure a lot of people will recognize. But he says, this isolation exists only insofar as other scientists are constantly busy recruiting investors, interesting and convincing people. The pure scientists, I know some people who are like this, they're really bright people who are very, very focused in the work that they do. And I sometimes wonder, they're mostly quite young, and I sometimes wonder if it would be a kindness to point out to them that somebody is getting the money to pay their salary to do this kind of thing. And those are the people who are doing the real relationship between research and policy. And that relationship is very much influenced by funding. So, according to Latour, research and its users are inherently linked. Scientists have to make it look as if they're independent, as I said before. But to do successful science, you need enrollment. Scientists want to maintain the laboratories, so they need to enroll funders. Scientists have to convince resource holders to pay for it, so they convince them they have a common interest. And one of the great examples, massive examples of this, which we all know about, was how the nuclear scientists of the 1930s convinced, particularly the American government, but also the German government, that they could produce a bomb and win the war if they were given a huge, which they were, machinery and huge facilities to pursue atomic science. When you're looking at the science policy relationship, as it actually, I think, is probably already quite obvious, a useful perspective is taken from the social policy literature on what they call the social problem process. Now, when you take this theoretical perspective on what you're looking at, you start by not assuming that something or other is a real social problem or not. This can be quite hard because those of us who do work on health inequality, for example, I mean, there's no way I'm going to take a symmetrical view of whether health inequality is really a problem or not. You know, I'm just not going to do it. But as an analyst of the debate on health inequality, the scientific debate and the policy debate, that would be what a strict social problem process scholar would do. So what you do instead is you examine the claims and who makes the claim. Now, this can be very useful, even if you're not able to be symmetrical yourself. You look at who says, oh, you know, health inequality is genetic. Okay, there's nothing we can do about it. And then there are other people who are saying health inequality is due to the bad behavior and the inadequate personalities of people who don't earn much money. Or you can take, that's a second claim, or you can take the claims that health inequality is due to people who have a low income, also combining the difficulties of less favorable working conditions, less favorable housing conditions, and so on and so forth. And this debate is now actually shifting again in a very interesting direction towards looking at the material interests, the financial interests that companies have had over decades to persuade people to eat more than is good for them, to smoke, to have motor cars everywhere. And there's some really interesting work which is just starting to be done in this area. But once again, that's a claim. Who's making it, who's paying for it, and what's in it for them? Now, my favorite case study at the time when I was doing my PhD, I would probably choose a different one today, but was a woman called Naomi Aronson, who did a study of pellagra. Now, I forgot what season it was, but in a certain season, in certain states of the United States, the farm workers suffered from a really nasty disease, weakness, rashes all over the body, and so on and so forth. And everybody knew these people were so poor that it was hard for them to get enough to eat. So the political claims came from, so here is your first participant in the policy process, were actually the trade unions, which tried to protect the farm workers, and the political parties that tried to advance their interests. Working class people get diseases like pellagra. Something's got to be done about this. This was then followed by the other side of the argument, if you like, the people whose interest it was to pay the farm workers such low wages. Farm workers are poor because they're ignorant. Now, this is very similar to what goes on with a lot of health inequality stuff. Then along comes a knowledge claim. A cheap, healthy diet is possible, but only if a new professional group who was looking for a way to have impact and secure funding for their growing discipline, which was the new profession of nutrition studies. And as it so happened, nutrition studies at this time in American history was a very new thing. and they didn't have any tenured posts in the universities. So they made the argument, very neat actually, that, well, if you'll pay for us to analyze the diets of the farm workers and analyze the prices of the different foods available to them, it's kind of cod's head soup stuff, that if anybody remembers this, we will be able to design a diet that they can afford, which will prevent them from getting pellagra. So this is a perfect example of what Latour calls enrollment. And it's a perfect example of how a bunch of scientists fit into the policy process. I don't actually know if they were successful, but it's still a very good example of the way these things work. And you'll see all these things. Once I open your eyes to these things, you'll start seeing them in your own work. So the social problem model is useful because it tells you who the actors are. Government, trade unions, workers' organizations, employers' organizations, and scientists, roughly. It gives a good indication of what groups are involved other than just the scientists, because the argument of Latour is that you won't understand the science unless you understand the other groups that the scientists are involved with. And it gives prominence to what I call the entrepreneurialism of professions. This is very important. Professions look for markets. They want to market their expertise. And you could say the same. I'm treating science as a profession for this purpose. Professions and experts need a market for their expertise. Here's an example. This is just to give you a list that you can add. I've made this up quite quickly. Actors in the science to policy process can include national and local government bodies, national government, local government, civil service, political parties, pressure groups, which I've mentioned, interest groups, intermediate organizations, which are usually regarded as think tanks. Well, think tanks are regarded as intermediate organizations. So you get IPPR and what's it called? Not reform. Anyway, there's lots of them. And professional organizations, which I've given you a little list there, but you can think of plenty more. And right down at the bottom, academic disciplines. These are an example of where you would look. If you are an academic discipline or you're doing a piece of science, these are examples of where you would look for people you wanted to enroll and make sure they heard about your work. But their interest would also be part of your everyday understanding of what work, how did your work get funded in the first place? Who is interested? And that, to a large extent, will determine what you're doing in the first place. So this is this kind of symmetrical, circular model rather than a linear model. I've introduced a couple of concepts. Moral fragmentation individualizes a social problem. An example of this is what Jenny Popey and colleagues have called lifestyle drift. So that when health inequality became a big issue for many years, all of the policy was based on behavior, changing people's behavior. That's the reason, and people like Johan Bakabak pointed out that the kind of moral failings, which meant that people couldn't adopt or were not able to adopt healthy lifestyle. And his idea was that these were partly genetic, but that went through a phase of having a big impact on health inequality, both research and policy. And you can see where the policy influenced the research. This is so blatantly obvious. And that the second concept I wanted to introduce was technical fragmentation, where the problem gets too complicated for anyone to understand it. And this happens very often. You'll hear in discussions on the TV between, a politician and a sort of TV anchor person, that the politician is obviously trying to blind people with science, what's known as blinding you with science. when you really get your back to the wall, the geneticists are brilliant at this. You get your back to the wall and you have to just confess, actually, that's not my total expertise. Economists are brilliant at it, by the way. People have to take, because the economists are so technically efficient and brilliant, people will take their advice pretty well sight unseen. Now, I think I'm going to skip over my example. Sorry, Peter. But the example that I was going to give was when the ONS set up a massive study that linked 1% of the England and Wales population from the 1971 census to death certificates. And that it was thought that would solve the problem, whether health inequality really existed. In those days, there were a lot of people who said it didn't really exist. And so they went along, they linked these data. Massive exercise. I mean, absolutely heroic stuff. And what happened in the first 2 years, well, I'll show you briefly. In the first 2 years, it looked as if this is the health inequality estimates that we got from the old method of the decennial supplements that gave rise to the Black Report. And in the first 2 years of the LS, which is linking individual people to their death certificate, look what happened. It looked as if health inequality pretty well disappeared. So my question used to be, and it's why didn't the scientists who carried out the study, one of whom is present at this meeting, why didn't they pop up and tell the government, which was a Tory government at the time, actually, health inequality doesn't exist. You don't have to worry about it. When you do a more complex, and this is a good example of technical fragmentation, by the way, when you do a more complex analysis, it disappears. The problem was that scientists did not accept those findings for reasons which I never did manage to actually find out, except it had something to do with the fact that I think if they went to the government and said, health inequality doesn't exist when you do the more technically efficient form of analysis, that probably would have been the end of the LS. And people had worked so hard. And the whole of ONS, or OPCS is what that time, was so identified with this fantastic data source that they didn't want it to be abolished. So what they did was they waited 3 years, and after 3 years, the gradient reappeared. So in the linked LS data, you had to wait for 3 years. Now, why was that? And here's when we come to the ultimate technical fragmentation. What the people involved in the LS coined or discovered was something they called the wearing off of selection. Now, I'm not even going to try and explain it here because I was talking to somebody involved the other day and they couldn't remember what it was. What happened here was nobody, this, which I won't read out, but this is an example in one of the regular reports on health reports that is put out by ONS. Now, if you can understand that, and you will have a photocopy of this slide, you're not a better man than I, but it took me 2 years to understand it. And I remember a few years later, the woman who was chief medical statistician at that point said to me, "Oh, for God's sake, Mel, you're the only person anyone knows who understands this stuff." And I'd had to understand it for technical reasons to do with my thesis. And I really stewed my brains over it. But nobody thinks about this anymore. And what actually did happen was that the idea that social class differences, if using social class to measure health inequality, was tricky, it was dodgy. And so we had a mutual adjustment between the ONS and powerful actors, which ended up with this sort of idea. Something strange about social class that no one can understand may create bias in the health inequality statistics. So health inequality research turn towards area studies and using education as a measure of social class. And the minute you start using education, you get back into this whole eugenic genetic stuff, are people smarter because of their genetics, et cetera, et cetera. And the result of that was that the powerful actors, for example, governments worried about criticism of their policies, no longer had to pay attention to social class inequalities in health anymore. And even a very, very senior scholar, who I hope is not sitting in on this meeting, wrote, we should be nameless, for good or ill, those of us concerned with social inequalities in health have stopped using the term social class. It has baggage and multiple meanings. So how does all this apply to Equalise? You have a much more explicit emphasis on your partners outside the laboratory, which I think is a great thing. But I think it means taking steps forward from this analysis and updating it and renovating it. So how does your closer engagement with your policy partners, your partners in the research policy process, how does this influence the way you design projects? How do you negotiate with partners over what will be studied and how results will be reported? And what do you do if objectives of different partners are in conflict? So what I'm going to do is leave you with these questions, because I think, well, there are people here who've been engaged in this kind of thing much more recently than me, and who I have had hints that people would like to give some examples. So I hope you will do that now, and thank you for your attention.